question. Isn't the competition, isn't that the landscape?
So that's what I would say is I think a lot of the time when we talk about competitive, and I've written an article about this if people are interested about my viewpoint on this, it's really like you want to understand the decision-making process of your competitor. And so you could actually play a rehearsal based on your competitors and how you understand your competitor and trying to get at like the core of the way they make decisions. But I would argue that competitors, I think, tend to fade a little bit into the background when it comes to the environment, which, yes, sometimes events will be about competitors because you want to be reactive in some way. But I think it's less important to actually set up a full game where there's two different parties that are playing against each other, is what I guess I would argue. Because one of the things like I found is, I don't know if people are familiar with Battle Camp, but Battle Camp was something that came out of like Wardley mapping a couple of years ago, but it required an awful lot of setup. And it required a lot of these types of war games can take days to weeks to actually prepare. And then over days, you'll run them. What I really wanted to do is I wanted to get to the point that we could have a game that we could pick up and play for an hour as a group of people. And usually when I talk about a group of people, I think about it as like product managers that are in a group product management meeting or in a quarterly strategic discussion. You can pull this type of technique out. You can play through a couple of these turns, and you can then start to understand like what could happen in the future and how might we actually react to that in some way. So that's why I guess I've just found that in general, yes, you will get events about competitors. And I think that's because it helps you test your reactivity to them. But I don't think you need to play two sides or three sides within this game. Does that make sense? But yeah, I think your competitor is part of the landscape. But that I would also add that for a lot of startups, it's actually not your competitor that's the biggest problem. It's actually getting the attention of your potential customers that is the biggest issue. So that's what I would argue. Cool. So yeah, so this is the basic loop for the kind of decision or strategic rehearsal. And in this initial mapping, you can use a bunch of different types of maps. I've experimented with kind of very simplified kind of experience, like journey maps. I've experimented with very simplified value chains. I've used Wardley maps. I think that Wardley maps provides like some more of the components around gameplay that are interesting. But honestly, you could use any type of map that allows you to talk about the situation at hand. And so that's where I think it's interesting for people to think about here. So there's also different types of events. And I've experimented with a lot of different types. Maybe the first type that I usually use is taking from like futurist and futurism camps, is this idea of looking at a signal and then extrapolating out what that could be. It could also include actual events from competitors that you think they might do, that type of stuff. So there's a lot of different possibilities around just extrapolation of signals from like the environment in some way. This is a list of climatic patterns that is, and I'm happy to share this later too, but I have a spreadsheet basically of all of the different things that Simon Wardley has talked about when it comes to like gameplay, climatic patterns, things like that. And so choosing one of these random climatic patterns to actually apply to your situation can be a good event. After that, I've used things like oblique strategy cards, which I have here. I have a deck of these, but they're basically like provocations, and people are not familiar with these. So Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt created them as a way to help writers and musicians unblock themselves in some way. And so there are a bunch of different provocations. As you can see in the picture, there's like a few that are there. Like it's destroy nothing or destroy the most important thing, what to increase, what to reduce. And these are more vague types of provocations. But I think when you start to take something that is more vague, or I would say like slightly confusing to the context, it actually opens up this possibility of understanding the world a little bit differently. And so I have another talk that I've done about like randomness in decision making. And that's where this is related in some way. And then finally, I've even used tarot cards. And so one of the things that I've done previously is tarot card readings for products. And essentially, again, it's using this kind of like vagueness and slight confusion to help people reframe what they're actually thinking about. And this is a lot of mysticism ends up being about this idea of almost like reframing or rethinking what is going on with the situation and maybe giving you a different viewpoint. So those are the types of events that I've tried out, and we'll try out a couple today. Now, when we are going to do our rehearsal, right, we need to actually map something. And so first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with everybody here the Miro that we're going to go to, and I'm going to add that to the chat. So if people want to go into that Miro, I've set up a bunch of boards that are essentially Wardley map boards with a few other things. And so grab one from there and just for the name, the strategy, and the decisions, you should be able to edit those boxes. And so just grab one and then put your name to claim it, and then I'll tell you what to do after that. Anybody having any trouble getting into the Miro board? Cool. Okay, I see a bunch of people in there. And if you run out of boards, I can make more. Just I figured this was enough, probably. So the top left one is not taken yet, if people want that. Or the bottom left. All right, cool. So if everybody has a board. So I was thinking a bit of what we might map, and this is one of those things that gets challenging, I think, for people that are not from all the same team. We tend to not all have the same context when it comes to a thing. But one thing that has been top of mind for everybody here, or has been top of mind for a lot of people, have been things like ChatGPT. And if people are interested in that, I'm happy to use ChatGPT. I think the thing that will be important is that if we all map the same thing, we can start to talk about how different decisions and different strategies create different outcomes. And so I would advocate that maybe we go after ChatGPT if everybody feels comfortable enough in understanding like what it does. I understand not everybody's going to have an architectural understanding of the way that ChatGPT works or the way the Transformer GPT model works, things like that. But if that's good enough, any other ideas besides just using ChatGPT? No? All right. I figure it's the hot thing right now. So let's just go with that. So what we're going to do is we're going to map ChatGPT. And what I'd like you to do first is I want you to go in there and I want you to just start creating kind of a traditional Wardley map. So create the user, talk about maybe one or two of the use cases that ChatGPT would be used for. I think the ones that we can mostly talk about, like in the generic sense, is more like basically synthesizing English language based on a prompt. But if you want to be more specific about the use case, I'm fine with that as well. And then I want you to break up a couple of the components that you think are important when it comes to this ChatGPT thing. And so I'll give people maybe not 10 minutes if people need that, but I'll do that. And if people are not familiar with how to do like Post-it notes, I can get some stickies put out there for you. All right. So I'll drop some stickies around everywhere if people need any. And then if you want to connect it, that's great. Really do whatever you feel is most appropriate or comfortable with. And yeah, so we'll just get started on that. But yeah, I'm just dropping like pre-made sticky notes a bunch of places if people want them. And are there any questions about this before we keep going? Nope. Okay. So I'll give everybody a few minutes.
So how do we treat ChatGPT? Is that an event that happens in the market, or is it?
I want you to pretend that you are ChatGPT doing your mapping first, and I want you to map some of the components that are there, and then I'm going to take you through an event cycle with some reflection, basically, which is the kind of strategic rehearsal method.
So the value chain to realize ChatGPT.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it's as if you were building or owning ChatGPT's strategy.
Okay.
So like OpenAI, you're thinking about OpenAI, thinking about relationships with people like Microsoft, the dependence on Azure compute. Maybe, again, there's a bunch of stuff, plugins that are starting to come out and how that starts to impact the ability to access the internet as a ChatGPT. There's a bunch of things like that. And so anyways, there's some ideas to put inside of your map, basically. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. How are people doing? Seeing some good maps? I think we'll give people like another couple minutes. All right, why don't we can start to just get to a good place so we can move forward a little bit. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I think it would be helpful for everybody to go and look around at the other maps that are nearby. So why don't you go and take a look at maybe another map or two that is in the space around you and see the way that people end up doing things. If you want to tweak your map at that point, I think that's fine too. So we'll give you about 5 minutes to look around and see the way that people have done maps. Any questions? Anything coming up right now that people are thinking about? Saw someone put AGI on their map.
We might have very different ideas of what we are actually mapping.
That's fair. That's fair. Yeah, I think that's that's one of the things I think you can do as a variant of this is actually building a map together as a team and then running through this, or building maps separately and then running the events separately. And so we're doing a little bit in between right now since we're all looking at each other's maps, but this one is meant to be more for like solo play in comparison to everybody else. I'll be right back 1 second. All right, have people taken a look around? Anything you're noticing about the other maps? that you're looking at?
Some are more that concrete. Aaron is very concrete, and I like that.
It's always great to see how different people map things, especially with such a low context prompt. Yeah. All right, cool. What I'd like you to think about now is I want you to think about what is your strategy, right? So if we're talking about, probably we have goals like expanding revenue, expanding user base, things like that. What types of things would you do to be able to maybe achieve those types of objectives? And again, I'm going to keep it fairly open for people, but if you want to grab onto something, maybe it's increase the user base of the chat. I want you to think about what is the type of decision making that you would end up doing. And so when I talk about strategy, I usually think about strategy as being really a way to codify decision making between two good options. And usually it's related to the idea of what are the two things we could do that would be valid, right, within our context, but that we will choose one over the other. And so I usually use kind of statements that are called even over statements, which is something like, if you've ever seen the Agile manifesto, it's like people even over process. And what that means is that it's not that we're never going to choose process, but it's that usually between the idea of people or process, we'll usually choose people. And so I want you to think a little bit about, if you were OpenAI or if you were the product manager for ChatGPT, what are some like important decisions or type of decisions that you would try to make? For example, it could be that you're always going to prioritize increase in user growth over revenue. Could be one of those things. And so I want you to think a bit about what would be your strategy in this particular case if you wanted to, in some way, go after a business goal for OpenAI to become a successful business in some way. Does that make sense? So I want you to think about that. And then there's a little space down below on each of the boards where you can write down kind of some strategic thoughts. It could be multiple. It could be in the format of an even over statement. It could be that we'll always prioritize this, whatever you want it to be, whatever you feel most comfortable with. Because I realize the even over statements is something that can take people a little bit of time to get used to. I'll provide like a link to that if people want to see that in kind of the way that works. Here, I'll post the even over statement post that I wrote if you're interested. But I want you to write what are a couple decisions that you think you'll be making in the future, or the way that you'll end up making decisions, and put that down in the little strategy area below your map. And the reason why we're doing this is that we want to actually create the idea that if we build a strategy that we're now going to communicate out to everybody within our organization, we want to ideally use that to actually make decisions. What I find a lot of people end up doing is that they end up just being very reactive and changing the way they make decisions very quickly, even when ideally the reason why we have these types of strategic documents is to align everybody into a similar way of making decisions. And so this would be like writing out your strategic document. Usually we have a couple page overview of the way that we want the team to make decisions within our group. And that is part of this like lattice work of documentation that includes like vision and maybe what are the headwinds that we're worried about, or what is the kind of competitive landscape like. So those are all the way that we end up using these types of documents is usually within this gameplay. We want to apply them to the gameplay. So I'll give everybody just a couple minutes to write down their strategy. Oh, and by the way, you don't have to write anything into the decisions yet. We're going to actually do a couple event loops, and that's when you can fill in the decision area. But if you want to put those decisions that you're putting in there down at your strategy for things that you think you will do, I think that's fine. But that's meant to be a log for the event play that we do in just a moment. All right. Do people feel comfortable moving forward a little bit? Maybe not. Maybe need more time. Okay. Great. So now when we take a turn within this strategic rehearsal, we're going to do a couple things. First, I'm going to give you a couple different events for each turn. I'm going to give you one event for this turn, and then we'll do another event, and then we'll add a couple events afterwards. And we'll try different event types so you can see how they feel. I want you to review that event. I want you to consider how that actually impacts your map and what actions you would take outside of the map. So it could be, do you want to move or add things, right? It could be that you want to, like, one thing that sometimes people have done is, I want to do some user research in X so I can understand something better. You'll then update the map in some way. And so you'll add new components, right? Which are usually to the left of components because you're getting started with them. Or you'll move components, and you'll usually move them to the right because you're trying to make them more adopted, or when it comes to maturity, you're trying to push them that direction. And I then, in the right side of your map, you'll see it says decision 1, decision 2, decision 3. For the first event, I just want you to write some notes in the decision one space about what happened. And I'll give you the event in just a second, but that's the way that we're going to do these event cycles, is that you're going to think about the event, you're going to consider and contextualize it to the map you have today. You're going to think about the actions you'll take, you'll update the map in some way, and then you'll note down what changed to create kind of a decision log. Any questions about this before I show you the event? All right. So the first event is that Google's Bard starts to steal users and your growth slows down. That is the first event. No, this is one of those types of events that's based on signals, right? Like Google released Bard recently, right? Google I/O was last week. But let's say in this hypothetical situation that you're in as OpenAI kind of product person for ChatGPT, that you're starting to see that your growth is slowing an awful lot, like you're not building quite as fast as you were, and you're starting to see that Bard's growth is actually ramping up. And so I want you to now think about what would you do in that particular case, based on not only what is going on inside your map, but I want you to look at your strategy, and I want you to think about, is your strategy prepared for this? And does it help guide the type of decision that you're now going to make inside the map? Any questions right now or any thoughts? Like, I'm going to give you a couple minutes just to consider this, but if you have any questions about the event cycle or the way that this loop is going to happen, I'm happy to talk about that.
Are there any implications that are obvious for you that are not obvious for me? Because I would ask, why are they following Bart? I would try to analyze that.
Yeah, that's fair. And so I think that's like a completely reasonable action, is to find out why Bard is gaining more. Like you could, again, like I said, sometimes the right action is actually just go do some user research, right? Like we need to find out more about what is the difference between Bard and us, right? Is there a way that we can start to understand that across a bunch of different types of conversations, what is the difference in quality potentially? Is Bard doing something when it comes to, say, marketing or advertising? Google is an incumbent, right? Like they have, I think we announced that it was like 8 billion user businesses that are going to be integrating generative AI, right? So like maybe there's just like an incumbent issue here. And so those are the types of things that you want to start analyzing and thinking about. But it could mean that you also want to take an action, right? Like you could talk about doing an advertising campaign. You could start doing things like that. So I think it's like any of those things, I would just jot down kind of those notes in the decision one that you plan on doing, and then update your map if you plan on adding, say, new functionality or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, any other questions? No? Okay, I'll give everybody about 3-ish minutes to think about this, update your map, and then write a decision log about what changes you're making. Or what actions you'll take. That's fine too. Oh, and by the way, it could be that if your strategy already has an execution plan and you feel like it's still appropriate, then that's an acceptable answer to log there as well. So it really depends on what you have in your strategy, whether you think it's still valuable. And I think it should be interesting, if you do end up changing your strategy, you should also note that down. Yeah, and just to be clear too, just write it under decision number 1, because that's in response to event number 1. All right, so I have a couple reflection questions I'd like to ask everybody right now. So 1, do you apply your strategy or not? Or how do you? I think one that I always find very interesting is, what would be the bizzaro version of your strategy and how would that impact your decision making? And when I say bizzaro, I mean that generally for me, a kind of smell test for whether something is a valuable strategy or could be a valuable strategy is that if you take the possible opposite of it, that it is also a valid strategy. And what I want you to consider is, what is the opposite of your strategy? And if you applied that to this current environment or market condition, how would that change your decision making? And so I want to be very clear about that. I don't necessarily mean that, and then this is where like Richard Rummelt from Good Strategy, Bad Strategy talks a lot about the idea of fluff in strategies. So be the best in something is fluff. And the reason why is because it's not a strategic position. You can't choose to be the best. You either are the best or you're not. And if you take the opposite of the bizzaro strategy of the best, it means the worst. And so to me, that's not like a hard decision to make, that you're going to make easier through the strategy. So I want you to start to think about, just in general, if you were to take the opposite, or, and by the way, like the not likely, but reasonable opposite of your strategy. So for example, some airlines go after very high kind of service types of components, and then others don't, because they don't want to compete in high service. They want to compete on price. And so those to me are two perfectly valid but opposite choices within a domain of strategy. And so I want you to think about what would be the opposite of whatever strategy you're currently using, and what would that mean? And so this is more of an internal reflection point. Any questions about that or thoughts? All right. And I want you to think now for a moment, what do you think is going to happen next? I want you to start to like project to the future of something that you don't know, which is, what do you think is going to be the reaction to whatever your action is? And what do you think is going to actually happen to the market conditions? Now, again, there's a high amount of uncertainty, but I think it's important for everybody to think about it and maybe write down one little note if you want to in the decision one area. And then we can move on to the next event. But I think this idea of constantly checking and trying to write down like what you think is going to happen next, so you can start to calibrate your ability to deal with the uncertainty of the world, is incredibly valuable. So there's a book called Super Forecasters, where it talks about people that do a lot of work inside of this idea of like forecasting of markets and of world events. And the fact that they need to write these types of forecasts down and then recalibrate afterwards to understand what type of information they were pulling from, I think this is an incredibly important activity for us to do as we calibrate the way we do strategy. So I want you to think about that for a second. All right, so we're going to go and pretend that a couple months later, right, let's say 2 to 3 months later of time has gone by. We're now going to do another event. And what I'm going to do for this event is so I'm showing you this climatic pattern spreadsheet that I have that I copied from someone else. And there's a bunch of different things here, like evolutionary characteristics, the patterns, doctrine, gameplay, and you can use almost any of these. We're going to try to use climatic pattern for this one. And so you can see that there's there's 28 of these different things. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a random number here between 2 and 29. All right, 10. So components can co-evolve. So this is the number, and then let's show this tab instead. So you can see here, it's components can co-evolve. So I'm going to paste this into the chat, and I'm going to paste the description into the chat. What we're going to do now is I want you to look at this climatic pattern, and I want you to think about how would you contextualize this to your current situation. So let's assume that components can co-evolve. All components can evolve, whether activities, practices, data, or knowledge, but they can also co-evolve. This commonly seen with the co-evolution of practice, how we do something, with the evolution of an activity, what we do, especially as we shift from products to more industrial forms. What causes this is the change in characteristic, I think is what got cut off there. So what I want you to do is I want you to think about inside of your map, what are some things that could or should better co-evolve? And so the purpose of this is to get you to start to think about the idea of, if you were to now do something in comparison to the way that you currently do things, you maybe change or alter, I want you to contextualize it to what you're actually doing. And I realize that this can be a little uncomfortable, it can be a little confusing, but that's the point of these types of exercises, is that what we're trying to do is we're trying to add a certain amount of confusion to what we're understanding to be able to potentially, again, reframe or re-understand what is going on. So questions about this? I'm sure there are some. Does anybody feel comfortable doing this? Who thinks it's hard?
I have an idea, but I don't know if it's off. But I'll try.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Should I explain?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just imagining, what if this atomic computing becomes a commodity, a product, then this computing power has been revolutionized. Am I ready to take up this new thing that would mean that it moves from maybe custom built to Genesis, even into, say, product or commodity?
Yeah, and how would that actually impact your ability to do things, or how you would actually build things if we're talking about a co-evolution, right? Like, how would that change your practice if this type of commodification of hardware continues to happen?
Users need to understand how this is working. Now it's not 0 and 1s anymore. Maybe it's totally different. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, and what you're talking about, what brought up for me was this idea of like analog computing, which is this concept that is trying to move away from not necessarily silicon, but the idea of using ranges, and it's usually very low power. It's the way they're taking the analogy of our brain, right? Analog is one of those things that is on the frontier. IBM is experimenting with this from a hardware standpoint. There's some groups that are, but there's no data centers that are full of analog chips. Yeah, at least in that traditional sense. Yeah. What else? How are other people considering this? So I want you to now think about, what would this change about your map? So how do you apply your strategy? Does it make you want to change your strategy if you feel like you are now going to be forced to co-evolve a practice and a thing you do within this map? I want you to start to think about it from that standpoint. And so again, go into the decision number 2. I want you to write some notes about what you might do differently based on this and go from there. All right. And then I want you to also think about, what is the opposite of this? What happens if things do not co-evolve? I love the faces I'm getting from Alejandro right now. This is a hard activity, right? This is not easy, because what we're doing is we're trying to think about the possibility of the future. And that can be very hard, especially in this is very low context, right? This is high confusion. Anyways, I think that's important. And then what do you think will happen next? So based on any changes you would have made here, what do you think is going to happen after this when it comes to the way that things work out? All right. And just to keep moving forward, let's pretend that several months go by, right? The world keeps moving forward. I'm actually going to pick out 2 tarot cards and then read them for you. And then I want you to use that as the way that you're going to consider an event. Okay, so I have a traditional Rider tarot card deck here. So I'll pick out 2. It just happened to be the Fool, by the way. That was one. And then I'll pick out another one. And this one is the inverted Knights of Swords. Okay. And so the way I would read these, and everybody's welcome to interpret them the way they want to. But in this case, the Fool is like walking off of a cliff. It's being followed by an animal. It's not paying attention, right? So he's like looking up at he's getting distracted by something, but he's just about to walk off a cliff. And so the question is what are the things that you're not seeing or sensing right now in the environment that you're not even trying to look for? And then when it comes to the Knight of Swords, if you look at it non-inverted, it looks like he's running from somewhere that is bad to somewhere that is more well lit. There's either flags or trees that are this direction. He's charging towards something in some way and doing it with a lot of anger, running towards battle, basically. Because it was inverted, though, what that usually means is the opposite. And what we should be talking about is what are we running away from? And what are the things that we're not ready to battle? And so I want you to take these 2 cards, the Fool and the inverted Knight of Swords. And I want you to try to now contextualize, what does that mean within your world? And I realize this is very difficult. Yeah, in the decision number 3, maybe write down a few notes about how you're contextualizing this in some way. And I'll give you 2 minutes, and then we can wrap up and talk about some questions if people have them.
I don't want to get political, but those last 2 tarot cards got me thinking of fake news to throw an election.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're absolutely. That's a great interpretation. What happens if, for example, all of these models, like Sam Altman says, are highly regulated by the government because of misinformation issues? What does that do to your business in some way? How does that either protect you because there's this regulatory capture that starts to happen, or how does that hurt you in some way if you have to adhere to new regulations? And so I think that's a great interpretation. Yeah, I love it. So I think I just wanted to check in here. Based on the gameplay we just did, what are some things that kind of came up for people, either in the way that you apply strategy, the way that you understand your map, the way that the events impacted your maps, things like that? I'd love for people to share if they feel comfortable what they thought was happening. Please, anyone.
I think for mine, I gave up a little bit, but it was because I hadn't mapped all of the ethics side of it.
Okay.
And therefore I started thinking about co-evolution on that side of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found it difficult with an incomplete map because my map wasn't very good.
Yeah, that's fair. We won't always have complete maps, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What else?
But one thing was to add things. I added this market research and advertising because that were components I missed in my map to be able to make a reaction to this marker AI.
Yeah, I think this idea of people wanting to do research is one of those things that we don't really necessarily think about, but is something that is valuable to actually sense make within the world that we're dealing with, right? And so I just don't think we usually apply that up front. And so it's a good thing to learn through this, that we should actually invest in research preemptively rather than waiting to react to something. What else?
It was a great firework I was not sure what we can put in 1 hour and 15 minutes before play. What I really like, what I did not make before, is I use it in storytelling, the constantly reframing. And this means when you teach or what you do, you train people to be more flexibility. And was great. It was a very new experience for me in Wardley map and to train something, to act, move, and fast discussions. Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
and honestly, so this is why I do this type of thing with product managers a lot, is because part of their job is to deal with uncertainty and to deal with ambiguity and to actually be reactive or to actually to take any action within that environment, right? And so I think we can gain some more comfort with uncertainty and ambiguity if we practice it. And so I think this is one of those things that can help you practice it. So I'm glad that came across. Thank you. What else?
It's great. I haven't done any gameplays before, so this is a step I need to go through, and I could also imagine apply all sorts of doctrines into this exercise as well. But
That's great.
yeah.
Yeah, I posted there's an article that I wrote for the Uncertainty Project, which is a kind of a site that talks about tools and techniques for decision making. And so if you want to check out and try this out on your own, I put a lot of instructions there. I also put modified versions of this, right? There's a lot of different ways you can add things to this gameplay that I think can adopt it for the way you need to do things. The tarot cards and even the kind of climatic patterns, sometimes people have a harder time dealing with those. And so sometimes I'll just generate bigger events based on signals. And so you should gauge your community about what they're like, where they're at in their comfort level around this, and maybe start with just events and then go to like weirder and crazier things as time goes on.
Yes, I was actually imagining the faces of my team coming with a and now we're thinking the other ways. Okay,
What I really like is when I look at the German military history before World Wars at Moltke, he teach his officers that you have to think two hierarchy levels higher. And I think gameplay and what you said is a very good tool to teach that. What if are you 2 levels higher? What can you do? And I was looking for such a method to do that, and I was not in gameplay. And now I think that was great experience for me to show that and to use this higher level thinking inside with the maps. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, and this is the thing that like, I think there's a bunch of different ways that they teach this inside the military. There are things like decision forcing cases, which are looking back at like putting yourself back in the situation and then playing it a case study forward, which helps build expertise in the sense that you're trying to always discern like data from noise inside of an environment. I think gameplay and wargaming decision rehearsal is more about future looking. And so you're not necessarily learning skills or experience prototypes. You're actually building possibility, I guess, is the thing. And your point about this idea of going up multiple levels, you can do this at almost any level that you feel is appropriate. And I think what's really interesting is that when you start to do this as a group, so you have the people that are more senior in the organization versus the people that are more junior, if you're able to talk or have them be on the same team, or even be like in parallel talking about what they do, you start to gain experience through the other people in the way that they make decisions. And that is, I think, super valuable, because a lot of the time, especially product managers, we don't spend a lot of time in the same room together, right? Like most of the time we're in the team that we're with cross-functionally. But if I can now hear how my VP talks about stuff, and I can hear how the most junior person on my team talks about stuff, we can all start to normalize this like alignment around how we make decisions. And that is incredibly important and valuable for a team. Yeah, I think it would be great to experiment with like very high level stuff, like we were talking about if you were the head of ChatGPT, which is they're a 300 person organization. So there's probably a small handful of people that would be like the main decision makers for ChatGPT. But like you could go all the way up to OpenAI, right? Which also includes research and a bunch of other stuff. And so I didn't really give you much instruction about that, but you are always able to decide what is this thing. And this gets back to like inside the military, the idea of the commander's intent. Is that also you can start to be very fractal about this. So if you wanted to do like a big war game, you could just like or decision rehearsal, you could decision rehearse your actual hierarchy, right? In the way that you would end up doing these, if quarterly, here's the overall strategy that they set for that turn of the game. How does that impact all the other teams that are now in the lower in the hierarchy in some way? So those are modifications you could start to do with this game.
I will do that next week.
Cool. If you need any support or anything like that, and by the way, you can I'll leave up the Miro if you want to use that as a template or anything. Just feel free to try it out. And then if you have questions, here's my contact information. I'm always happy to like answer questions and help out however I can. Just let me know. But yeah, thank you everybody. Good job today in dealing with some very highly ambiguous and weird tarot cards. You all deserve a round of applause as well. So thank you so much for the time today. And I'll share out the slides as well.